The Grim Sleeper, a grim nickname indeed for a serial killer, but it's not just the name that's ominous. Lonnie David Franklin Jr.'s two-decade reign of terror is one that broke records in the crime world. Not only is he LA's longest operating serial killer, he has the potential to be the most prolific serial murderer in the United States. This is the story of the Grim Sleeper, the man that is the poster child for a wolf in sheep's clothing. And you're tuned in to Evidence Obscured, the place where the rabbit holes go down the deepest, darkest, and most disturbing paths that killers are capable of inflicting on others. Like, subscribe, and let's get into it. When the body of Deborah Jackson was discovered in August of 1985, police weren't all that invested in solving her murder. The problem with LA in the 80s was that there were so many serial killers operating at the same time that they quite literally couldn't keep up with it all. Now, I've covered a lot of overlaps on this channel, but the sheer amount of serial killers operating at once in this case astounded even me. They were all grouped together and named the South Side Killers because investigators genuinely believed that this was all just one killer. The victims fit a pretty standard profile: young black women, usually sex workers, and with a long history of drug use. Almost all of them were strangled, sexually assaulted, and dumped in alleyways and dumpsters that were located along the south side of Los Angeles. South Central LA was especially volatile. Lots of drugs, unemployment, and so much violent crime that police were too overwhelmed to even begin to solve the 1,300 homicides that were already being processed that year. Deborah's murder was unusual even among the sea of murdered women. For one, her purse was with her body, so robbery wasn't the motive, and she'd been shot 3 times in the chest. Gun-related murders were not even among the other serial victims being found at the time, and she hadn't been dumped out of a moving car like most of the others were. Instead, she'd been carefully hidden under an old carpet for several days before she was found. A year later, almost to the day, Henrietta Wright was found dead, strangled, hidden under a mattress in an alley, and shot twice in the chest. She was naked from the waist down and had a piece of a man's shirt stuffed down her throat. The task force matched the bullets between the two women almost immediately, and surprisingly tagged these 2 deaths as a potential new serial killer right out the gate. Given the colossal amount of homicides they were combing through, I cannot fault their work here, but they were forced to wait yet another year for more clues. The first being that this guy wasn't some insatiable maniac who had no control over his urges. This was a cold, calculated killer who was willing to be patient. 3 years, 3 victims. He was so in control of himself that he could space out his murders, further muddying the waters for police. On January the 10th, an anonymous caller called 911 to report that he'd seen someone dump a body in an alleyway. The caller described a blue and white Dodge van and even gave them the license plate number, but he refused to give his name. Hey, this was Southside, the place where the only time police came around was to harass, intimidate, and arrest the already struggling residents. But the caller wasn't lying. In that alley, they found 23-year-old Barbara Ware. She'd been assaulted, shot in the chest, redressed, and he put a trash bag over the top half of her body. Then he placed a gas can over the bottom half of her body to conceal her amongst the garbage where she'd been placed. They collected DNA, but given the era, they had to wait for technology to catch up before they could sequence it. The van, on the other hand, was found that same night, parked in the parking lot of a nearby church. The engine was still warm, but there was no one anywhere near that church. Actually, that van belonged to the church, and all of its management were adamant that it hadn't been driven by any of them. Its keys were accounted for, and none of their members and staff were in or around that building or that van all day. When the ballistics matched the first 2 murders, police set up a small task force just for this killer. They were sure now that this guy was unique in the sea of murderers using LA as their personal amusement park. 2 more women were killed that year, Bernita Sparks and Mary Lowe. Both were assaulted, shot, and their bodies staged in alleyways. But LaShrika Jefferson, who was killed at the start of 1988, was strange. Yes, she was placed in another alleyway, had been assaulted and partially undressed. The difference came with the note that the killer left behind. A napkin was laid over her chest with the words, AIDS written on it. LaShrika was not HIV positive, but given the heavy stigma around the disease in the 80s, it's extremely plausible that she told her attacker this in an attempt to get away, or that the killer just objectified all sex workers as diseased objects that did not classify as human to him. Either way, the killer also left DNA on her body, so the idea of catching a disease wasn't enough to stop him. And finally, Alicia Alexander was found under a mattress, shot, strangled, and assaulted. And then a victim in Nitra, Washington, escaped. The 30-year-old was walking back from a friend's house when a middle-aged black man driving a rust-colored Pinto stopped next to her with an offer of a lift. Suddenly, the friendly man turned around and shot her in the chest. Bleeding and half-conscious, Anitra was assaulted repeatedly, with the killer stopping only to take photos of her with a Polaroid camera. She was dumped in an alleyway and miraculously managed to crawl to a nearby house for help. That's when everything just went dead on the case. The killer had a task force dedicated to him, and now on top of all of that, a survivor who gave police a description of his car, his face, and DNA. The killer slunk into the shadows. Authorities disbanded the task force after just a year, and while they cleaned up the crack epidemic and rounded up the monumental amount of murders of women running around, this mysterious killer patiently bided his time. For 14 whole years, there were no signs of him. Back then, they called him the .45 caliber killer, but that nickname was about to evolve into a much more sinister name when he reappeared in 2001. Just 4 days before Christmas, 15-year-old Princess Bartholomew was found in an alleyway, shot, strangled, and assaulted. 2 years later, Valerie McCorvey suffered the same fate, and her body had DNA on it too. The previous samples had by now been uploaded to CODIS, so the bullets and DNA lit up investigators' screens like a billboard on the Hollywood Strip the second it came in. They had no one to match it to, but they were sure that the 1980s series of murders had picked up again and that he hadn't killed anyone in more than a decade. That's where the moniker, the Grim Sleeper, came from. This realization that a serial killer had gone into hibernation for 14 years. But that didn't mean squat in the grand scheme of things. They had all this evidence, but none of it could be tied to any one individual. By the time Genesia Peters was found naked inside a garbage bag, LA was in an uproar. The South Side hadn't had this kind of violence to deal with since the 90s, and now history had come back to haunt them all over again. Anitra, the only survivor, was brought in again nearly 2 decades after her ordeal. After reliving that night of hell again, police were able to create a sketch of the suspect and the car, and she took them to the street where the man had picked her up. She was sure that his car had come from one of those driveways. But again, the Grim Sleeper went dark. The sudden attention driven by the media was enough to drive him back into another hiatus. That's until 2010, when CODIS finally made a partial match. Remember, this guy was leaving so much DNA at the crime scenes that they had a perfect sequence. It was only a matter of time before a familial match was made. The relative that it matched to was a 20-year-old by the name of Christopher Franklin, who, judging by the date, was the son of their killer. Christopher was a felon in prison for firearm and narcotics charges, so the law required him to submit his DNA to the database when he was convicted. Christopher's father was Lonnie David Franklin Jr., a 57-year-old man who lived right on the same street that Anitra had taken them to not long ago. And just to add to the embarrassment, Lonnie had been under police's noses this entire time. The friendly mechanic that had a wife and 2 kids had been in for various crimes over the past 3 decades. He'd faked disability at his sanitation job, which he was investigated for. Lonnie was brought in for grand theft auto twice, and he was a well-known swindler of car parts and for stealing plates, not to mention 2 pretty serious fights that resulted in assault charges. On one hand, Lonnie was a decent dude with the sweetest family and a friend to everyone in the neighborhood. But on the other, he was an unpredictable criminal that got into hot water more often than any blue-collar family man should. Actually, everything else about Lonnie was unremarkable. Other than his habit of getting arrested for relatively minor crimes, that is, he came from a good, well-to-do family, and despite his many arrests, he hadn't been caught on any serious crimes, certainly no crimes related to sexual deviancy. Otherwise, his DNA would have been in the system long ago. Heck, his family were about as cookie-cutter as you could hope for on the otherwise impoverished south side of LA. What they didn't know was that Lonnie and two other men had viciously gang-raped a teenager in Germany during his stint in the army, but those records had never been available to them since it occurred in Europe. A couple of things were starting to add up on this side of the pond, though. That blue and white Dodge van that belonged to a church that was seen by a witness, Lonnie attended that church and he had a set of keys because he did a lot of maintenance for them. A lot of the victims were hidden under car carpets and gas cans, all items that he got from repairing vehicles out of his backyard. All of the bodies were found in alleyways that directly correlated with Lonnie's garbage truck route during the 80s and were located just minutes from his house. It took them a few weeks of surveillance, but they eventually caught him eating a slice of pizza at a family gathering where his wife, daughter, and grandkids were all in attendance. That single bit of pizza crust was fished out of the garbage by an undercover officer, and bingo, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was their man. Despite never being convicted of a sexually motivated crime, having no felonies, and having never been on their radar at all in more than 20 years, the unassuming mechanic who'd been married his whole adult life and who still lived in the same house he'd lived in since he began killing, and officially, the longest operating serial killer in LA's history.
California and Colorado are the only states that allow familial DNA searches, but the Grim Sleeper case is bound to change that.
A search of his house yielded the same gun used to kill all the victims and an astounding amount of Polaroids. Remember how Anitria said her attacker took photos of her? Well, it turns out Lonnie took more photos than the 10 victims they were aware of, over 1,000 of them. Some were candid, others sexually explicit, but in others, the women looked to be in distress, and in some, they were almost certainly already dead. Here's the problem. Not all of these women were victims of any crime. Most of them were alive and well, and were identified pretty fast. But the 10 known victims were among the Polaroids, as well as 180 others that were either found to be murdered, missing, or who couldn't be identified. Were the original 10 only the ones that were linked because they fit a specific MO, but in truth, Lonnie veered off from the expected pattern, causing law enforcement to miss others? That's definitely true. We know of one more victim, a 36-year-old man named Thomas Steele. He was only linked to Lonnie because he happened to be shot to death in '86, and the ballistics were tied to the decades-old cold case. The IDs of 2 missing women, Aaliyah Marshall and Rolenia Morris, were also among the trophies he kept hidden behind an old fridge. Yet, their bodies have never been found.
Junior, for the first-degree murder of Deborah Jackson as alleged in count 1 and the special circumstance of multiple murder, it is the judgment and sentence of this court that you shall suffer the death penalty. The total non-death sentence is life plus 25 years to life plus 14 years, all of that consecutive.
We know that the Grim Sleeper strangled his victims too. It's all but certain that some victims would not have survived the strangulation, so using a firearm would not have been necessary. So how many people did Lonnie Franklin actually kill? 10, 20, 100? Police have tied him to 6 additional murders during the time that they initially thought he was dormant, but they have decided against filing those cases. There just wasn't enough evidence for a conviction on those women, and he'd already been successfully sentenced to death for the 10 women they were able to get matching bullets and DNA from, bringing the total count up to 17 victims that we know of. Lonnie certainly wasn't talking. Even with all the DNA, the bullets, the trophies inside his house, and the guilty verdict, he never admitted to a single thing all that time he spent on death row. He did not contest the verdict, did not give any interviews, and remained silent on the matter until he was found dead in his cell at the age of 67. His wife remained married to him until he died, never believing that he could have committed these crimes despite the overwhelming amount of evidence against him. Honestly, there isn't much of a debate on whether or not he's guilty. The evidence is just too damning to kid ourselves otherwise. The real questions lie in how many of those Polaroids still hold victims, how many women are dead, where are their bodies, and how many families are still out there not knowing what happened to their sisters, their daughters, and their mothers. I have a feeling that time will not give us more answers. Just like the Grim Sleeper, some questions go into hiding, never to see a resolution. See you in the next one, people.